morning, everyone. Welcome to Gospel Connect, and a Happy New Year to you if you're joining with us for the first time. Gospel Connect is the weekly devotional from NP Connect, where we reflect on the amazing grace of God. In today's episode, we're going to be reflecting on gratitude. In Psalm 116, the psalmist says, "I love the Lord, for he heard my voice, he heard my cry for mercy, because he turned his ear to me. I will call on him as long as I live." As you read this psalm, you see that it is a psalm loaded with gratitude. And gratitude is a rightful response in the heart of a worshipper for all that God has done. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul taught us to sing to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, teaching one another and admonishing one another, and always with thankfulness in our hearts to God. Thankfulness is at the center of our worship. Of course, many mental health professionals have long promoted the benefits of adopting an attitude of gratitude, meditating and practicing thankfulness. Practicing gratitude can increase our self-esteem, can improve our relationships, can help to establish a positive mindset. And nobody wants to live in a world that is grey and dull all the time. And practicing gratitude can sometimes change our focus to help us to be more mindful of the things and the blessings that we may have overlooked in our lives. But how can we get more gratitude? How can we develop the attitude of gratitude? Well, one of the ways I think for the Christian is just to simply meditate on what God has done and to meditate and reflect on God's character. That's certainly what the psalmist does. He says that the Lord is gracious in verse 5 and righteous and full of compassion. The Lord protects the unwary. When I was brought low, he saved me. Now, the psalmist isn't just a theologian giving us facts about God and the nature of God, that God is compassionate and righteous, etc., etc. He's a poet. He's a songsmith. He's telling us how these facts about God's character relate to him and his life. He's telling us what God has done for him, and his heart overflows with thankfulness. It's interesting, he begins, "I love the Lord." That is a declaration of his intent to worship God for what God has done. The greatest commandment in the Old Testament was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. In fact, it was as the Israelites were given this command, they had been rescued from a land of oppression, rescued from the oppression of Pharaoh, and they were brought out of the land for the purpose of worship. God said to Pharaoh through Moses that they may worship me on my holy mountain. The psalmist continues to say, "For you, Lord, delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before the Lord in the land of the living." You know, God has rescued us for a reason, and it's to restore us to our rightful place of worshipping him, of walking with him. Now, to walk with God is to obey his commandments and his laws, and so worship is more than just a mouthful of praise and singing hymns and songs. It truly is a heart of thankfulness that overflows, that causes us to walk in God's ways, to be obedient to God's laws. That is the purpose of mankind, to walk with God. And it's interesting, isn't it, that God was said to walk with Adam and Eve in the garden. Enoch walked with God. And the psalmist then asks the question, "What shall I return to the Lord for all his goodness to me?" Of course, there's nothing that we can do, say, or sing that can work ourselves into God's affection and God's acceptance of us. What we must do is believe in his provision for us. And the psalmist says as much. He says, I will lift up the cup of salvation. Of course, that is the Lord's salvation. And call upon the name of the Lord. The psalmist trusts in the Lord. I trusted in the Lord. And that is what Jesus calls us to do. He was once asked, what are the works we must do? And he said, the works that God requires is this, to believe in the one in whom he sent. Jesus was God's provision. Jesus was God's salvation for his people. And the psalmist ends the psalm by saying, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. Truly, I am your servant, Lord. His heart is so grateful that he wants the Lord to know that his life belongs to the Lord. He will serve the Lord. I will sacrifice a thank offering for you and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord. True biblical thankfulness isn't just a disposition of heart, but it actually causes us and leads us to walk in God's ways. So, how can we practice the attitude of gratitude? We can take time to reflect, like the psalmist does, on what God has done for us regularly, and to think about God's character, his righteousness, his compassion, his gracious disposition towards us. God bless, and have a great week.